it's amazing to me that you go back and you think of, I always think of this it's so stupid and crude, but Thomas Friedman, the sort of, he's less trendy now, but just, still one of the grand poobah morons of, the U.S. McWorld. In the late 90s, because we also should honor that this is the 20th anniversary of the Battle of Seattle, which was an incredible moment of protests against the WTO, and a true act, by the way, of global justice and globalization of solidarity and ecology. And you see people in mainstream outlets suggesting that Trump's xenophobic fantasy life reflects the protesters because they were opposed to the WTO, and you consistently see this in the neoliberal media, which is a conflation of people who want a post world, a evolved world, a good world, and ones who want to regress even further than the world that the Thomas Friedman's already created as somehow representing the same thing, because they both object to, as an example, a predatory organization like the WTO. But at any rate, Thomas Friedman used to talk about the golden straitjacket. And the golden straitjacket was what countries needed to do with their fiscal policy in order to participate in the global economy. That's fundamentally and very, he wouldn't use this language, but everybody understood that was anti-democratic. You could have a vote. You could have Coke versus Pepsi. Maybe there was a little bit of, one party was kick you a touch more spending in education. Maybe. Certainly if you were, totally under World Bank or IMF dictate, you couldn't. And then maybe one was a bit more socially progressive or not. And that was it. Everything else was designed to turn your country over to Monsanto or Chevron or Microsoft or whatever. And so the idea that then they turn around and say a guy who has a successful mandate and is doing what people want is somehow anti-democratic is pernicious, dangerous propaganda, and I think we really need to interrogate. This is never going to be a show that uncritically that just says, oh, you oppose the West or the U.S., we support you. I'll say again, Assad committed war crimes, even regardless of chemical weapons uses. Every faction in Syria, as far as I can tell, with the exception of the Kurds, have committed significant war crimes. Putin is not a liberatory force in the world. And countries in the pink tide have made legitimate and their own mistakes at times. We're never going to just, we're not doing that. At the same time, there is what could only be, it is a ivory tower tendency. And particularly when you are talking about whether in the Middle East or Latin America, and you are under siege, and particularly in Caribbean and Latin America, you are totally under siege from the world's most powerful hegemonic force is here, waging coups, interfering with your elections, funding opposition groups, all of this stuff constantly. And the Washington Post and the Guardian and the New York Times will repeat that propaganda. And then sometimes some people on the left will find a valid critique, but even those valid critiques, what organic constituency is it connected to? That's another very serious question. Yeah. Even Nicaragua. People ask me about it all the time. I get the criticisms of Ortega. I really do. But when people suggest that there's a third authentic Sandinista faction, well, what do they represent? It's like, 3 million people voted for Ralph Nader in 2000. I think they were right. Not in terms of strategic voting, but that certainly would be the best expression of my politics. But how much does that have to do with what was happening politically in the United States then? At any rate, sorry.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add, because when you hear liberals complain, especially in the Washington Post and the New York Times about AMLO, there's all this talk about the institutions. Let's remember that most of these institutions that were put in place by the PRI and also by the PAN were put into place to maintain a system. Like we made this point a couple of weeks ago on the show that it's not very helpful. It's important to remember that the dichotomy between poor and rich countries confuses a lot, because let's not forget that Mexico had the richest person in the world, Carlos Slim, just as recently, from 2010 to 2013, and they were able to, create a lot of personal financial wealth because the political economic system encouraged that kind of behavior. So now AMLO coming at some of these political institutions that were set up to grift off of the poor, to take advantage of people, to take advantage of working people. Yeah, he is going to be fighting against these institutions, and that's a good thing. You know, you need to recognize that not all these institutions are as neutral as they present themselves to be, and oftentimes have a very specific economic goal towards them.
And by the way, including, I don't know if he still does, but Slim used to have an ownership in the New York Times, I believe.
Yeah.
So, I mean, speaking of laundering institutions that might not be neutral arbiters,
No, absolutely,
for a basic social democratic agenda. I mean, that's another thing that is just so disgusting about liberals when they talk about this stuff. You are talking in most of these cases. You are not. I mean, there is a revolutionary project like Cuba, which did incredible things for people, objectively, and it had its mistakes. Blah blah blah. We know all this. In most of these cases, and certainly in AMLO's case, you are literally talking about, can you give us permission for 1 second without funding coups and propaganda and death squads and astroturf groups and writing stupid editorials about our institutions to do some type of soft version of the New Deal for our own country? It's disgusting. And they still make Lula a political prisoner. Matt. What's a literary? Yeah, you got something. What's a literary reference for this?
I mean, I was just going to talk about Bloomberg and Xi Jinping.
Well, please.
You
We're going to get
clip?
to that later. Well, we're going to do that for the bad, but I think that that's very apropos. That's a very well, right? No, but I mean, look, Bernie has been terrorized because he won't call Maduro a dictator. Maduro isn't a dictator. He does not fit a proper definition of what that word is. Not a dictator. And incidentally, the things that you might object to that have happened in Venezuela, I asked you to look at them strategically. Yeah, they've cut some terrible. They absolutely have worked with predatory military and narco networks. Maybe one of the big reasons that they haven't been deposed in a CIA coup. Sorry, guys, this is politics. Let's be real. And by the way, look, Xi Jinping has centralized a huge amount of personal power in China. There's no doubt about it. But you could still even argue that it's more of a collective system than an individual system if you want it to be more academically precise about China. But Bloomberg could just sit there and be like, I don't think it's a dictatorship. They do opinion polls. What? There are a lot more democratic operations happening in Venezuela than China, I could assure you.
Did you hear about the guy who IM'd into Majority Report saying that your positive references towards Castro make it difficult to reach out to refugees of Castro's Cuba? And I think about that.
Look,
and
I have been looking to develop more contacts in the Miami cocaine trade. Sorry.
Jesus Christ.
I mean, my thing is like, you look at what happened to Morales, you look at what's happened to leaders in Latin America generally. It's like, yeah, you can't defend every individual act of violence that was carried out in the name of the Cuban Revolution. At the same time, it has longevity. And I don't know, it's a difficult world we live in, but I would say maybe the best audience for TMBS isn't those parents.
It isn't, but I also ask. I mean, it's so funny because I don't like woke scolds. I don't like black or white moralists, and I don't like. Look, if somebody said Fidel Castro created a utopia and he never abused people's rights and they didn't suppress books and they didn't, by the way, until quite recently, relatively speaking, have some atrocious policies on AIDS and gay people, and people weren't silenced because of what they thought. And that's something obviously I oppose. And some people who fled, not all of the people who fled were, Batista oligarch CIA gangsters. Of course, there were innocent people who fled. I can acknowledge every single one of those things. And at the same time, and of course that I already know there's a certain contingent that get all triggered by that. But then on the flip, can you acknowledge that that Che was in Arbenz's Guatemala right before, literally on behalf of a fucking banana company, we had this terrorist coup backed by the CIA that they tried to kill Castro like upwards of hundreds of times using the mafia, the CIA. I mean, that, and also, by the way, that US-backed regimes like in the Dominican Republic or Haiti delivered absolutely nothing for their people.
Oh, yeah.
And had worse human rights abuses in terms of the imprisonment, torture of opposition, and so on. And that the Cuban Revolution and Castro represent hope for a big part of the world, because literacy, healthcare, and because a little island fought off U.S. imperialism, sent amazing troops to fight for liberations in Angola and South Africa, and even when they were totally marginalized in the 90s, was still just a voice against a hegemonic world system that destroys people's lives on a daily basis. I just want to acknowledge all of that. That's all I want. That's all I want.
I'd also just add that, like, Castro was a critic of Castro, like even
Yes,
up until
absolutely.
at the end of his
If
life.
you read anything.
Yeah, he really, well, especially towards the end of his life, he really went through a lot of the, early mistakes of the revolution and gave clarification for it. I mean, obviously it's coming from him, but this was a society that was literally had a imperialist power at war with them from the get-go. So you don't make good decisions when you're always, at threat of just being completely annihilated.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I mean, I'm not being flippant about Venezuela, right? Like, what would you do? What would your strategic position be? Right. And then look, there's a whole other conversation. I mean, Eva Gollinger, who's amazing on that. Yeah, she says, look, there was a lot of pre-existing state apparatus for corruption, which was never cleaned up and is a systemic problem. There's a reliance on oil, which is a systemic problem definitionally in terms of scarcity of resources and global ecology. And at the same time, you have, at least under Chavez, you've radically cut poverty. You've really improved the lives of a lot of people. You know that since at least 2002, the United States has been trying to remove you. You know there's a massive band of oligarchs that will remove you. And then you have a military. Well, what do you do? I mean, honestly, like, these are real questions. They aren't just like, I think these are some real questions in the context of the United States. I mean, I think that some of the things around how the Democrats, obviously mainstream Democrats, are so empowering of the intelligence and defense agencies and have used this process against Trump to support some incredibly bellicose policies in Eastern Europe is dangerous to the extreme. And at the same time, on a relative political level, this guy needs to be destroyed politically. So how do you work in alliance with people? What's strategically effective? What isn't strategically? I mean, politics is always an interplay between these things. And what I find is that a lot of people, some people go to either purely strategic groups, and that's a problem because they have no compass, or people are all compass with no strategy. But then the other problem is that then it's, compass for one thing, and there's no critical awareness of anything else. And that's increasingly the case, that you just can't say, people get triggered by a critical comment about everything, including, examples that are just embarrassing, right? Like, I think it's urgently important in the United States that we have a way more smart and sophisticated conversation about Iran, China, and Russia, that have a much deeper understanding of how those places work, what their legitimate grievances are, and what their successes may or may not have been. Now, if you think that those are anti-imperialist socialist utopias charting us in a just, ecologically balanced world, you're fucking delusional. Period. And I'm not going to indulge it. And at the same time, if you think, I just need to get rid of Trump, or that the United States isn't the most dangerous hegemon on earth, you're fucking delusional. And so I think what we're trying to do here, and the reason things like the pink tide are so important, is that we're trying to find these alternative vectors of power where they legitimately exist. And Castro and the Cubans are definitely one of those.
I would say,
if you can't see that in the historical scope, I mean, I don't know what to tell you.
I would challenge any of the IDW platforms to have this sort of conversation about this topic and see what sort of content they produce.
Talking about ideas. You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.